A detective's salary isn't glamorous. After years of dangerous work, late nights, and watching criminals live better than you do, some officers start asking themselves a question. What if I was on the other side? For most detectives, that thought never goes further. But for the ones we're discussing today, it became their reality. They looked at organized crime's money, power, and protection, and decided their badge was worth selling. These detectives had all the crucial information: advance warning on raids, names of confidential informants, and details about ongoing investigations. Information that could mean the difference between a mobster walking free or spending life in prison. It's a chilling betrayal that feels unreal, but it's a dark, repeated fact in police history. Today we're breaking down the most shocking cases of detectives who became mob informants. You'll learn how organized crime recruiters target law enforcement, what kind of information these corrupt detectives provided, and how their betrayal impacted real investigations and real victims. These are the stories of detectives who chose the wrong side. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. On March 9, 2005, federal agents arrested two retired NYPD detectives in Las Vegas. Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa were decorated investigators from the NYPD's elite Major Case Squad, officers who'd built reputations solving some of New York's most difficult cases. But for nearly a decade, while wearing their badges, these men had been doing something unthinkable: working as contract killers and informants for the Lucchese crime family. Eppolito and Caracappa ran a systematic criminal enterprise from inside the NYPD. They sold confidential information about ongoing investigations. They revealed the identities of informants. They ran license plates for mobsters. And when the mob needed someone killed, these detectives did it themselves, using their badges as cover to commit murder. They were involved in at least 8 murders, countless compromised investigations, and were on a whole new level of corruption. Their story reveals how deep corruption runs and finds its way into law enforcement, and how two men sworn to uphold the law became two of the most dangerous criminals in New York history. Louis Eppolito was born into the mob world. His father, Ralph "Fat the Gangster" Eppolito, was a member of the Gambino crime family. His uncle, James "Jimmy the Clam" Eppolito, was a capo. Despite this heritage, or perhaps because of it, Louis joined the NYPD in 1969, seemingly determined to break the cycle. He became a skilled investigator, earning 11 police commendations and the Detective of the Year award in 1984. He worked high-profile cases and seemed to embody the tough but honest Brooklyn cop. But Eppolito never truly left his roots behind. He wanted recognition and money, writing a book called Mafia Cop about his experiences growing up surrounded by organized crime while serving as a police officer. He appeared on talk shows, consulted on mob movies, and even had small acting roles. Beneath the decorated detective's exterior was a man who had too much interest in the criminal world he was supposed to be fighting. Stephen Caracappa presented a different image entirely. Born in 1942, he joined the NYPD in 1969, the same year as Eppolito, though they wouldn't become partners until later. Caracappa was quiet, methodical, and intense, the opposite of Eppolito. He rose through the ranks to become part of the Organized Crime Homicide Unit. In this role, Caracappa had access to information that could destroy mob operations. Details about ongoing investigations, the identities of confidential informants, and surveillance operations targeting organized crime families. Where Eppolito was the talker, Caracappa was the thinker. He understood how investigations worked from the inside, which made him useful to criminals trying to stay ahead of law enforcement. The two detectives became close friends in the 1980s, bonding over their work and their Brooklyn backgrounds. But their friendship would become something far more sinister when they caught the attention of Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family. Casso was one of the most violent and paranoid mobsters in New York. He was convinced that informants had infiltrated his organization, and he was right. What Casso needed was someone inside law enforcement who could tell him who those informants were. He needed someone who could access police databases, run checks on suspected traitors, and warn him about upcoming raids. He needed cops. By the mid-1980s, they had made contact with Casso through Burton Kaplan, a drug dealer and Lucchese associate. What started as selling information quickly escalated into something far worse. Casso didn't just want intelligence, he wanted action. And these two decorated detectives were willing to provide it. For their services, Casso paid them $4,000 a month, plus bonuses for special jobs. It was the beginning of the most corrupt partnership in NYPD history. The arrangement between Casso and his two detective informants began simply enough. Ippolito and Caracappa would run license plate checks and provide information from police databases, tasks that seemed minor but were incredibly valuable to organized crime. If the mob suspected someone of being an undercover officer or informant, these detectives could confirm it within minutes. If a mobster wanted to know who owned a particular car or where someone lived, Ippolito and Caracappa could find out using law enforcement resources. But Casso wanted more than information. He wanted to eliminate threats to his organization, and he recognized that having two NYPD detectives on his payroll presented opportunities that went far beyond intelligence gathering. These men had badges, guns, and the authority to pull people over, enter buildings, and act without any consequences. They were the perfect weapons. The relationship progressed through Burton Kaplan, a marijuana dealer who served as the middleman between Casso and the detectives. Kaplan had known Ippolito since the 1970s and trusted him despite his badge. Kaplan would receive orders from Casso, then meet with Ippolito and Caracappa to relay those orders and deliver their monthly payments. The detectives were careful about maintaining operational security. They never met directly with Casso, always communicating through Kaplan to deny any direct involvement with Casso. As their confidence grew, so did the scope of their criminal activity. They were now actively participating in murder plots instead of just running database checks, using their knowledge of police procedures to help the mob avoid detection. When Casso wanted to know if someone was cooperating with law enforcement, Caracappa would check confidential files. When the mob needed someone found, Ippolito would use police resources to locate them. What made their operation particularly scary was how they used their legitimate police work as cover. Both detectives continued handling real cases, maintaining their reputations as effective investigators. Caracappa's position in the organized crime homicide unit was especially valuable. He was investigating the same crime family he was working for, which gave him access to the most sensitive information and allowed him to sabotage investigations from the inside. By the late 1980s, Ippolito and Caracappa had become Casso's most valuable assets. They'd proven their loyalty and their capability. They'd provided information that helped the mob avoid law enforcement, and they'd shown they were willing to get their hands dirty when necessary. What came next would transform them from corrupt cops into cold-blooded killers. Casso began giving them assignments that went beyond information gathering. He had enemies, rival mobsters, potential informants, people who'd crossed him or knew too much. And he wanted them dead. Most mob hits required careful planning, avoiding police detection, and dealing with the aftermath of investigations. But with two NYPD detectives doing the work, many of those problems disappeared. They could pull someone over without creating suspicion. They could enter crime scenes afterward and potentially influence the investigation. They were the perfect killers because they were the ones who would normally be hunting the killers. At this point, Ippolito and Caracappa were no longer just informants. They were soldiers in the Lucchese crime family, and they were about to embark on a killing spree that would terrorize New York. The murders began in 1986 and continued for nearly over a decade. The Jimmy Heidel case was their first known hit, and perhaps their most famous. James Heidel was a young associate who'd participated in a failed attempt to kill Anthony Casso. Casso survived and wanted revenge, but Heidel had gone into hiding. This is where having detectives on the payroll became useful. Using police resources, Caracappa located Heidel at his mother's house in Brooklyn. On September 17, 1986, Eppolito and Caracappa showed up in an NYPD-issued car. When Heidel saw the badges, he likely felt relief the police had found him before the mob did. That relief lasted seconds. The detectives pulled their weapons and forced Heidel into their vehicle. They drove him to a garage where Anthony Casso was waiting. What happened next was described years later in court testimony. Casso tortured Heidel for hours, trying to extract information about who had ordered the hit on him. Heidel was beaten, shot, and brutalized. When Casso was finished, the young man's body was never found. The detectives had delivered him like a package, then likely helped dispose of the evidence. The Israel Greenwald murder followed in 1986. Greenwald was a diamond merchant and small-time criminal who had borrowed money from Burton Kaplan and couldn't pay it back. But more importantly, Greenwald knew too much about Kaplan's drug operations. Casso ordered the hit, and Eppolito and Caracappa carried it out. They lured Greenwald to a garage in Brooklyn under the pretense of discussing the debt. When he arrived, they shot him dead. His body was buried in a mob-controlled location and wouldn't be discovered for nearly 2 decades. Next came the Anthony DeLappy murder in 1990. DeLappy was a Lucchese soldier who'd gotten on Casso's bad side during an internal power struggle. Worse, Casso suspected DeLappy might be cooperating with law enforcement. Through Caracappa's access to federal databases, they confirmed that DeLappy was indeed in contact with the FBI. Casso ordered him killed. The detectives tracked DeLappy to Los Angeles, where he'd fled after sensing danger. On February 4, 1990, they found him outside his girlfriend's apartment. Caracappa walked up and shot him multiple times. They were 3,000 miles from New York, killing someone on behalf of the mob, using information obtained through their police positions. The Bruno Facciolo murder later that year was equally cold-blooded. Facciolo was a Lucchese associate who Casso suspected of being an informant. Once again, Caracappa checked law enforcement databases and confirmed that Facciolo had been speaking to the FBI. On August 21, 1990, Facciolo was found shot in the head, stuffed in the trunk of a car in Brooklyn. A dead canary was stuffed in his mouth, a mob message that he'd been killed for talking. The murder bore all the hallmarks of a professional mob hit, and no one suspected that NYPD detectives had pulled the trigger. The Eddie Leno murder in 1990 was perhaps the most audacious. Leno was a made member of the Gambino crime family, and killing him violated mafia protocol. You don't kill members of other families without permission from the commission. But Casso wanted Leno dead because of a decades-old grudge, and he didn't care about the rules. On November 6, 1990, Eppolito and Caracappa pulled Leno over on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, using their police credentials. Leno, seeing the badges, rolled down his window. Caracappa walked up and shot him multiple times in the face, then drove away. The Bartholomew Borriello murder in 1991 was a favor for John Gotti. Borriello was a Gambino soldier, and his death was ordered by Gotti himself. Casso lent out his detective assets to the Gambino family, and on April 13, 1991, Borriello was shot outside his home in Brooklyn. While Eppolito and Caracappa may not have pulled the trigger themselves on this one, they provided crucial intelligence and support. Between these murders, the detectives continued their regular duties as NYPD investigators. Eppolito worked cases and did media appearances. Caracappa remained in the organized crime homicide unit, investigating murders that he and his partner may have committed. They attended police functions, collected their paychecks, and maintained their reputations as solid detectives. What's equally disturbing is how close they came to never being caught. Most of their victims were criminals themselves, people whose murders wouldn't generate massive public pressure for solutions. The cases were investigated by their fellow detectives, who had no reason to suspect that 2 of their own were responsible. Evidence was difficult to get because the killers knew exactly how to avoid leaving it behind. For nearly a decade, two of New York's most decorated detectives were also two of its most prolific killers, and no one suspected a thing. By the mid-1990s, both detectives had retired from the NYPD and moved to Las Vegas. Ippolito opened a restaurant and continued pursuing his entertainment aspirations. Caracappa lived quietly, maintaining a low profile. They seemed to have gotten away with everything, leaving behind a trail of unsolved murders and no evidence connecting them to the crimes. But their former boss, Anthony Casso, was arrested in 1993 and facing life in prison. In 1994, seeking a reduced sentence, Casso began cooperating with federal authorities. In his debriefings, he dropped a bombshell. He'd had two NYPD detectives on his payroll for years, and they'd committed multiple murders on his behalf. He identified them as Louis and Steve and provided details about their crimes. However, Casso's credibility was problematic. He was a career criminal with every reason to lie, divert attention, or minimize his own role. The FBI was unsure. Casso's story seemed almost too unbelievable. Two decorated NYPD detectives working as mob hitmen. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. Moreover, Casso couldn't initially provide the detectives' full names or detailed enough information to identify them. The investigation stopped progressing for years. Federal prosecutors were reluctant to pursue charges based only on Casso's statements, especially without physical evidence or witnesses. Casso himself proved to be a nightmare witness. He continued committing crimes even while in protective custody, getting into fights and violating the terms of his cooperation agreement. Eventually, the government ended his cooperation deal entirely, making him even less useful as a witness. The breakthrough came from Burton Kaplan, the man who'd connected Casso with the detectives. By 2004, Kaplan was in federal prison on drug charges and facing the rest of his life behind bars. Federal investigators, who'd never completely abandoned the investigation, approached him with a deal. "Tell us everything about the corrupt detectives, and we'll consider reducing your sentence." Kaplan had resisted for years, but he was in his 70s, sick, and had no realistic hope of ever leaving prison. On March 3, 2005, he began talking. Unlike Casso, Kaplan could provide specific details, full names, dates, locations, and the exact nature of the crimes. He described the monthly payments, the specific murder assignments, and how he'd served as the middleman. He could place Ippolito and Caracappa at specific locations at specific times. Kaplan's cooperation gave federal prosecutors what they needed. On March 9, 2005, FBI agents arrested Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa at their homes in Las Vegas. The two retired detectives, now in their 60s, were charged with racketeering, 8 counts of murder, and conspiracy. The investigation that followed the arrests uncovered even more disturbing details. Investigators found evidence that the detectives had interfered with dozens of investigations during their careers. Confidential files had been accessed inappropriately. Informants who'd mysteriously disappeared might have been identified and targeted by Ippolito and Caracappa. This earned them the nickname Mafia Cops, and it was one of the worst corruption scandals in NYPD history. The trial of Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa began in March 2006 in Brooklyn Federal Court. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Burton Kaplan's testimony. Over several days, the 73-year-old drug dealer laid out the entire operation in detail. He described how he'd recruited Ippolito in the 1980s, how Caracappa had joined the arrangement, and how they'd carried out murder after murder on behalf of Anthony Casso. Kaplan testified about specific payments, specific meetings, and specific murders. He admitted his own role in the conspiracy without hesitation, understanding that his testimony was his only chance at spending his final years outside prison. The prosecution also had more than just Kaplan. They presented phone records showing contact between the detectives and Kaplan during the relevant time periods. They produced bank records showing suspicious cash deposits that coincided with when Kaplan claimed to have paid them. They brought in forensic evidence from murder scenes and connected it to the testimony about how the killings had occurred. There were also witnesses who testified about seeing Ippolito and Caracappa in places they shouldn't have been. A witness placed them near the garage where Israel Greenwald was murdered. Another testified about suspicious behavior by the detectives during investigations. Former NYPD colleagues testified about how Caracappa had access to confidential files and had made database queries that seemed unrelated to his assigned cases. The defense's strategy was to paint their clients as dedicated cops who'd been falsely accused by career criminals looking to reduce their own sentences. Ippolito's attorney emphasized his commendations and Detective of the Year award. Caracappa's attorney portrayed him as a quiet, dedicated investigator who'd been wrongly caught up in a conspiracy theory. Neither defendant testified in their own defense. On April 6, 2006, after 5 hours of discussion, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. However, the victory was short-lived. In July 2006, federal judge Jack Weinstein made a shocking ruling. He threw out the murder convictions. Weinstein ruled that the maximum amount of time had expired on the racketeering charges related to the murders. It was a technicality, but it was valid under law. In September 2008, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Judge Weinstein's decision, reinstating all convictions. The appeals court ruled that the criminal enterprise had continued past 1990 because the detectives continued receiving payments and providing information to the mob, which meant the statute of limitations hadn't expired. The legal battle had taken years, but the convictions stood. All that remained was sentencing. On March 6, 2009, Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa stood before Judge Weinstein for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with family members of victims, former NYPD colleagues, prosecutors, and media. The two former detectives, now in their 60s, faced the moment when their betrayal would receive its final judgment. The victims' family members were given the opportunity to address the court. Betty Heidel, mother of Jimmy Heidel, the young man who'd been kidnapped and tortured to death, delivered an emotional statement. She described decades of not knowing what happened to her son, of wondering if he was still alive somewhere, of the agony that came with eventually learning the truth. She spoke directly to Ippolito and Caracappa, calling them the lowest form of life for using their badges to commit murder. Other family members had the same sentiments. They spoke of lives destroyed, of justice perverted, of the special pain that comes from knowing police officers, people who were supposed to protect victims, had instead been their executioners. The daughter of Israel Greenwald described growing up without her father, never understanding why he'd disappeared, only learning decades later that he'd been murdered by detectives. Judge Weinstein, despite his earlier concerns, called the defendants' crimes the most heinous series of crimes ever tried in this courthouse. He noted that they had systematically betrayed their oaths of office, violated the public trust, and used their badges as licenses to kill. The sentences reflected the seriousness of their crimes. Life in prison plus 100 years for Ippolito. Life in prison plus 80 years for Caracappa. Neither would ever be eligible for parole. The two former detectives were led from the courtroom in handcuffs, facing the rest of their lives behind bars for betraying everything a badge represents. Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa were immediately transferred to separate federal prisons to serve their life sentences. Neither man showed remorse or admitted guilt, maintaining their innocence even after conviction. The case forced the NYPD to confront uncomfortable questions about oversight, accountability, and how two detectives had operated a criminal enterprise for nearly a decade without detection. The department now had new protocols for monitoring database access, strengthened internal affairs procedures, and created additional safety measures to prevent similar corruption. For Burton Kaplan, his cooperation earned him a reduced sentence. He was released from prison in 2013, having served additional years beyond his original drug sentence. He lived quietly until his death in 2017, having spent his final years outside prison walls, something the men he testified against will never experience. Anthony Casso, whose cooperation had initially revealed the corrupt detectives, but who proved too unreliable to testify, remained in prison. He died in 2020 at age 78, having spent the last 27 years of his life in custody, never receiving the sentence reduction he'd sought. Luis Ippolito died in prison on November 3, 2019, at age 71, having served 14 years of his life sentence. He maintained his innocence until the end. Stephen Caracappa died on April 8, 2017, at 74 years old, serving his life sentence in a federal facility. He has exhausted his appeals and will almost certainly die in prison. The Mafia Cops case remains one of the worst corruption scandals in American law enforcement history. A dark reminder that the greatest threat to justice sometimes comes from those who swore to uphold it. This next man perfected the art of turning a badge into a weapon. He didn't just act as an informant, he controlled the entire investigation. John Connolly. John Connolly was a rising FBI agent in the 1970s. Connolly was tasked with breaking the Italian mafia's stranglehold on Boston's underworld. He had informants, gathered intelligence, and helped bring down some of the city's most powerful mob figures. By all means, he was exactly what the FBI wanted: a street-smart Boston native who understood the criminal landscape and knew how to work it. But behind the commendations and successful prosecutions, Connolly was running one of the most corrupt law enforcement operations in American history. His star informant, James "Whitey" Bulger, wasn't helping the FBI destroy organized crime. Instead, he was using the FBI to destroy his competition while building his own criminal empire. And Connolly was actively protecting a murderer, tipping him off to investigations, and allowing him to commit crimes under protection. For nearly 2 decades, Connolly gave sensitive law enforcement information to Bulger and his partner Stephen Flemmi. He warned them about wiretaps, revealed the identities of informants who were later murdered, and sabotaged investigations that threatened his sources. All while Bulger's Winter Hill gang terrorized Boston with murders, extortion, and drug trafficking. The case would eventually expose corruption within the FBI's Boston office, lead to wrongful convictions being overturned, and reveal that the Bureau had essentially granted immunity to some of Boston's most dangerous criminals. At the center of it all was John Connolly, a decorated agent who'd sold his badge to the Irish mob. John Connolly was born in 1940 in South Boston, a tight-knit Irish-American neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and loyalty meant everything. Southie, as locals called it, had its own code. You didn't cooperate with authorities, you protected your own, and you respected the neighborhood's power structure. Growing up, Connolly knew the local tough guys, including a young street thug named James "Whitey" Bulger. The Bulger family lived in the same housing project as the Connollys. Whitey's younger brother, William "Billy" Bulger, was close in age to John Connolly, and the two became friends. Billy Bulger would go on to become one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts, serving as president of the Massachusetts State Senate for 17 years. This connection between the Connolly family and the Bulgers would both shape John Connolly's entire career and ultimately destroy it. Despite his Southie roots, Connolly wanted something different. He attended Boston College, then Suffolk University, and in 1968 joined the FBI. It was an unusual path for someone from his neighborhood, where the FBI was viewed with suspicion and hostility. But Connolly saw an opportunity. He was smart, ambitious, and hungry for recognition. He wanted to be somebody. Connolly's big break came in 1975 when he was assigned to the FBI's Organized Crime Squad in Boston. The Bureau's top priority was dismantling the Italian Mafia, which controlled much of Boston's criminal activity through the Patriarca crime family. The FBI's strategy relied heavily on developing informants within the mob, people who could provide inside information in exchange for protection. Connolly knew exactly who to recruit: Whitey Bulger. By 1975, Bulger had evolved from a street criminal into a major organized crime figure. He'd served time in federal prison for bank robbery, where he'd connected with members of other criminal organizations. After his release, he'd risen through the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American criminal organization that controlled bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion in South Boston and beyond. Bulger was smart, disciplined, and absolutely ruthless. He'd already survived multiple gang wars and emerged as one of Boston's most feared criminals. But Bulger also understood something. The FBI's obsession with the Italian mafia could be exploited. If he became an FBI informant, he could use the bureau to eliminate his Italian rivals while protecting his own operations. In 1975, Connolly officially recruited Bulger as an FBI informant, and also recruited Bulger's partner, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, who'd been an FBI informant in the past. Flemmi was a stone-cold killer with connections to both Irish and Italian organized crime. Together, Bulger and Flemmi would become the FBI's most productive sources in Boston, or so it appeared. What the FB I didn't fully understand, or chose to ignore, was that Connolly's relationship with Bulger went far beyond handler and informant. It was a partnership. Connolly idolized Bulger, viewing him as the ideal version of the tough, respected Southie figure he could never be. He socialized with Bulger, accepted expensive gifts, and treated him not as a criminal asset, but as a friend. Connolly's FBI supervisors were thrilled with the intelligence Bulger provided about Italian mobsters. What they didn't realize was that Connolly had changed the entire purpose of the informant program. Instead of the FBI using Bulger, Bulger was using the FBI. What started as overly friendly relations with informants evolved into active participation in protecting criminals from prosecution. By the late 1970s, Connolly had established himself as the FBI's expert on Boston organized crime. He filed regular reports documenting the valuable intelligence Bulger and Flemmi were providing about the Patriarca family's operations. The information was good. Detailed accounts of mafia meetings, names of associates, descriptions of criminal activities. Connolly's supervisors praised his work, and he received commendations for his effectiveness in handling top-level informants. But the information Bulger provided had a pattern. It always targeted his competition, never himself. Bulger would identify Italian mobsters involved in loan sharking while running his own loan sharking operation. He'd reveal mafia gambling operations while operating his own bookmaking network. He'd provide details about mafia murders while committing murders himself. The FBI was so focused on destroying the Italian mob that they failed to see that they were enabling an equally dangerous Irish mob to grow more powerful. When other law enforcement agencies began investigating Bulger's criminal activities, Connolly would intervene. He'd argue that Bulger was too valuable as an informant to be arrested. He'd claim that investigations might destroy ongoing FBI operations. In 1980, Massachusetts State Police were conducting a gambling investigation that included Bulger's operations. Connolly learned about it and immediately warned Bulger, allowing him to shut down the operation before it could be raided. When DEA agents began looking at Bulger's involvement in drug trafficking, Connolly again intervened, arguing that Bulger had immunity as an FBI informant. The pattern repeated over and over. Law enforcement would target Bulger, and Connolly would protect him. The relationship became financial as well. Bulger gave Connolly expensive gifts, cash, jewelry, trips. When Connolly's wine store business struggled financially, Bulger arranged for money to flow into it. Connolly bought a condominium in Boston. Bulger's associate helped with the purchase. The agent and the gangster were so close that Connolly attended Bulger's family gatherings, socialized with him openly, and considered him a genuine friend. Connolly also created relationships with other FBI agents and law enforcement officials who could be useful to Bulger. He brought his FBI colleague John Morris into the arrangement, introducing him to Bulger and Flemmi. Morris, who supervised Connolly at various points, would end up in the same situation he had: cash payments from Bulger and providing protection in exchange. By the mid-1980s, Bulger and Flemmi were virtually untouchable. They operated their criminal enterprise openly. knowing that the FBI provided them with a shield. They had advance warning of every investigation, knew which criminals were cooperating with authorities, and understood exactly how much they could get away with. Other criminals in Boston began to suspect that Bulger was either an informant or had FBI protection, which made him even more dangerous. Anyone who challenged him might find themselves the subject of FBI attention. Meanwhile, Connolly's career flourished. He received commendations, promotions, and recognition as one of the FBI's most effective agents against organized crime. In 1990, he was transferred to the FBI's headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, where he worked on terrorism and organized crime issues. He seemed to have successfully navigated his entire career without consequences for his corruption. Unknown to Connolly, information was quietly building against him. Other law enforcement agencies were taking note of the suspicious pattern of failed investigations against Bulger. Defense attorneys in mob cases were beginning to question why certain criminals never got prosecuted. And within the FBI itself, some agents were uncomfortable with how Connolly handled his informants. The crimes John Connolly became a part of weren't just small acts of corruption. He provided Bulger and Flemmi with confidential law enforcement information, becoming an accessory to murder, even if he never pulled a trigger himself. The Brian Halloran murder was perhaps the most direct example of Connolly's involvement. In early 1982, Brian Halloran approached the FBI with explosive information. He claimed to have witnessed James Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi murder Roger Wheeler, a businessman from Oklahoma who owned World High Lie. Wheeler had been shot in the head in Tulsa in 1981, and Halloran said he'd been recruited as a getaway driver but backed out at the last moment. This should have been a breakthrough, direct testimony linking Bulger to murder. Instead, it became a death sentence for Halloran. The FBI Boston office, including agents who worked closely with Connolly, documented Halloran's cooperation in reports that circulated through the office. Within weeks, Bulger knew that Halloran was talking to the FBI. On May 11, 1982, Bulger and an associate waited outside a Boston restaurant where Halloran was drinking. When Halloran and his friend Michael Donahue left the bar and got into Donahue's car, Bulger's vehicle pulled alongside them. Multiple shooters opened fire with automatic weapons, killing both men. Donahue, who had nothing to do with organized crime and was simply giving Halloran a ride, died because he was in the wrong car at the wrong time. Evidence would later strongly suggest that Connolly, or someone in the FBI's Boston office, had leaked information about Halloran's cooperation. Bulger knew Halloran was talking, knew what he was saying, and knew enough to plan the murder. The FBI's own informant system had become a murder weapon. The informant murders extended beyond Halloran. In 1981, Bulger and Flemmi murdered John McIntyre, a drug trafficker who was cooperating with law enforcement about a marijuana smuggling operation. Once again, Bulger seemed to know exactly who was talking. McIntyre was lured to a house, interrogated, and killed. His body wasn't found for nearly 20 years. In 1985, they murdered Deborah Hussey, Flemmi's stepdaughter, who Flemmi had sexually abused for years. Hussey knew too much about the gang's operations and was becoming unstable. After killing her, they buried her body in the same location where they'd buried other victims. Each murder occurred while Bulger and Flemmi were active FBI informants under Connolly's protection. Throughout the 1980s, Bulger's organization was deeply involved in cocaine and marijuana trafficking. This directly violated the terms of his informant agreement, which supposedly prohibited him from committing violent crimes or dealing drugs. But when DEA agents or state police tried to investigate Bulger's drug operations, Connolly would again intervene. In 1988, DEA agent Daniel Doherty was building a drug case that involved Bulger's organization. Connolly contacted the DEA and argued that the investigation needed to be shut down because it would compromise Bulger's value as an FBI informant. The FBI's Boston office supported Connolly's position, and pressure was applied to abandon or limit the investigation. Bulger's drug trafficking continued. The manipulation of FBI reports was systematic. Connolly would file informant reports that made Bulger and Flemmi appear to be providing crucial intelligence about Italian mobsters while carefully leaving out details or downplaying their own criminal activities. When other informants provided information about crimes committed by Bulger or Flemmi, those reports would somehow disappear. Connolly also created false documentation to protect his informants. When questions arose about whether Bulger and Flemmi were still useful enough to justify continued protection, Connolly would manufacture reports claiming they'd provided critical intelligence. Some of this intelligence was recycled information, gossip, or details about crimes that had already been solved. But it created a paper trail that made his informants appear invaluable. The extortion and racketeering operations Bulger ran enjoyed FBI protection throughout the 1980s. Bulger controlled bookmaking operations throughout South Boston, collecting payment from every bookmaker in the territory. He ran loan sharking operations that charged extremely high interest rates and used violence to collect debts. He extorted legitimate businesses, demanding regular payments in exchange for protection. All of this activity was reported to law enforcement by victims and witnesses. But when Boston police or Massachusetts state police would try to build cases, they'd encounter FBI resistance. Connolly and his colleagues would argue that any prosecution of Bulger would compromise larger investigations into Italian organized crime. The corruption of other agents was another dimension of Connolly's crimes. His FBI colleague John Morris accepted at least $7,000 in cash from Bulger and Flemmi. Morris also accepted cases of expensive wine, dinners, and even a prostitute arranged by Bulger. Morris leaked information to Bulger about investigations and provided the same protective cover as Connolly. When Morris was later questioned about his corruption, he admitted that Bulger and Flemmi had essentially owned him. The crimes that Connolly assisted in included at least 19 murders, countless extortions, decades of racketeering, and systematic obstruction of justice. And all of it happened while he carried an FBI badge and claimed to be fighting organized crime. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, reporters at the Boston Globe, particularly investigative journalists Gerard O'Neill and Dick Lair, had been digging into Bulger's operations and his suspiciously cozy relationship with the FBI. In 1988, they published a front-page story revealing that Bulger and Flemmi were FBI informants. This revelation triggered something Connolly couldn't control: serious investigation. Defense attorneys in mob cases began demanding FBI informant files, arguing that if Bulger and Flemmi were informants, they might have provided false information used to prosecute their clients. Federal judges started ordering the FBI to disclose information about its informant program. In 1994, federal prosecutors in Boston, working with DEA agents and state police, built a massive racketeering case against Italian mobsters that had taken years to develop. As defense attorneys reviewed the evidence, they discovered something shocking. The FBI had hidden evidence about Bulger and Flemmi's criminal activities. The informant files revealed that the FBI knew Bulger and Flemmi were committing murders while serving as informants. In late 1994, federal prosecutors made the decision to indict Bulger and Flemmi on racketeering charges. This was extraordinary. The FBI's prized informants were being charged by the very government they supposedly served. The indictments included charges of murder, extortion, and drug trafficking spanning decades. On December 23, 1994, FBI agents moved to arrest Bulger and Flemmi. They arrested Flemmi without incident, but Bulger had vanished. Someone had tipped him off, and investigators immediately suspected John Connolly. Bulger fled and would remain on the run for 16 years, eventually landing on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. John Morris, Connolly's FBI colleague, cracked first. In 1998, facing potential prosecution, Morris admitted he'd accepted bribes from Bulger and leaked information to him. Morris received immunity in exchange for his testimony, but his admissions confirmed what many had suspected. The FBI's Boston office had been compromised. evidence mounted against Connolly. Investigators discovered that he'd warned Bulger about the 1994 indictments, giving him time to flee. They found documentation of the gifts Connolly had received. They interviewed criminals who testified about Connolly's protective relationship with Bulger. Former FBI agents came forward, describing how Connolly had blocked investigations. In 1999, John Connolly was indicted on federal racketeering charges. The decorated FBI agent, who'd once been praised for his work against the mob, now faced prosecution for protecting mobsters. He retired from the FBI and hired defense attorneys, preparing for the fight of his life. John Connolly's federal trial eventually began in May 2002 in Boston. The prosecution presented evidence that Connolly had accepted at least $235,000 in cash and gifts from Bulger and Flemmi over the years. They showed how he'd leaked information about ongoing investigations, warned Bulger about legal troubles, and systematically protected murderers from prosecution. They documented how Connolly had tipped off Bulger in 1994, allowing him to flee and remain on the run. The person key to the prosecution was former FBI agent John Morris, who admitted his own corruption while describing Connolly's more extensive crimes. Morris testified that Connolly was completely compromised, that he'd essentially become Bulger's agent inside the FBI, rather than the other way around. Morris's immunity deal was controversial. Many felt he deserved prison, but his testimony was crucial. The prosecution also presented testimony from Kevin Weeks, Bulger's former right-hand man, who'd pleaded guilty to racketeering and agreed to cooperate. Weeks described how Bulger had openly discussed having FBI agents on his payroll, how he'd received advance warning about investigations, and how he'd learned that Brian Halloran cooperated with authorities, information that led directly to Halloran's murder. Stephen Flemmi, still facing his own charges, also testified against Connolly. Flemmi described the cozy relationship between the FBI agent and the mobsters, the gifts exchanged, and the protection provided. While Flemmi's credibility was questionable, given his own crimes, his detailed testimony was similar to what other witnesses had said. On May 28, 2002, after discussing for several days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on racketeering and obstruction of justice charges. They convicted him of accepting bribes, leaking confidential information, and warning Bulger about his impending indictment. However, they acquitted him on some counts, including charges that he'd directly caused Brian Halloran's murder by leaking information to Bulger. The federal trial was just the beginning. Florida prosecutors were watching closely, preparing their own case against Connolly, one that would ultimately result in a murder conviction and ensure he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. On September 16, 2002, John Connolly appeared for sentencing in federal court. Connolly's attorney asked for leniency, arguing that his client had dedicated his life to law enforcement and had believed he was serving legitimate purposes. Character witnesses described Connolly as a devoted family man who'd made terrible professional judgments but not a corrupt person at heart. Judge Joseph Toro didn't believe it. In his sentencing remarks, he noted that Connolly had crossed the line from being an FBI agent to being a criminal. He emphasized that Connolly's corruption had undermined public trust in law enforcement and had directly facilitated murders. The sentence, 10 years in federal prison. Many victims' family members felt it was not enough given the scope of Connolly's crimes, but it was within federal sentencing guidelines for the charges he'd been convicted of. Connolly was immediately placed in custody. He served his federal sentence, but in 2005, while still imprisoned, he was indicted in Florida for the 1982 murder of John Callahan, a businessman killed by Bulger's gang. Florida prosecutors argued that Connolly had provided information to Bulger that led directly to Callahan's murder. In 2008, a Florida jury convicted Connolly of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Combined with his federal sentence, Connolly would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He's currently incarcerated at a Florida state prison, maintaining his innocence and claiming he was a scapegoat for the FBI's institutional failures. Whitey Bulger remained on the run until 2011, when he was captured in California after 16 years of hiding. In 2013, he was convicted of racketeering and involvement in 11 murders. He was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years. In 2018, at age 89, Bulger was beaten to death by fellow inmates shortly after being transferred to a West Virginia federal prison. Stephen Flemmi pleaded guilty to racketeering charges and is serving a life sentence, having cooperated with authorities in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The Connolly case forced the FBI to completely change how it manages confidential informants. New protocols require stricter oversight, documentation of informant activities, and accountability for handlers. The Boston FBI office was essentially rebuilt from the ground up. For the victims' families, Connolly's conviction provided some measure of justice, but it couldn't restore what was lost. His story is one that proves that the greatest threat to justice can wear its uniform. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into organized crime history. John Connolly was an agent serving a mobster, but this next guy was an agent who decided to build the mobster's empire himself. Harold Paul Rico. H. Paul Rico seemed like the ideal FBI agent. Well-dressed, soft-spoken, and efficient, he spent 3 decades building cases against the Italian mafia in Boston and Miami. He helped secure convictions against some of organized crime's most dangerous figures. And when he retired from the FBI in 1975, he left with commendations and the respect of his colleagues. But beneath the polished exterior, Rico had committed crimes that would shock even hardened law enforcement officials. For years, he'd protected murderous informants while allowing innocent men to be convicted and imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. He'd hidden evidence that would have cleared those men of any wrongdoing, letting them spend decades behind bars to protect his sources. And after retiring from the FBI, he'd gone to work for a businessman with deep mob connections, eventually participating in a conspiracy that resulted in murder. Rico's corruption was not limited to accepting cash bribes or living the rich life. It was something more harmful. He believed that protecting his informants justified any cost, including the imprisonment of innocent people. He famously told a congressional committee that the wrongful convictions were regrettable but acceptable because his informants had helped prosecute other criminals. When asked if he'd felt any guilt about innocent men spending 30 years in prison, Rico coldly replied, "What do you want? Tears?" His case exposed the darkest aspect of the FBI's informant program, agents who became so invested in protecting their sources that they lost any sense of morality or justice. Rico's corruption lasted over 40 years and destroyed countless lives, yet he maintained until his death that he'd simply been doing his job as an agent. H. Paul Rico was born in 1925 in Belmont, Massachusetts, a middle-class suburb of Boston. He served in the Army during World War II, then attended Boston College before joining the FBI in 1951. Unlike John Connolly, who came from the rough streets of South Boston, Rico was educated, refined, and seemingly incorruptible. He was exactly the type of agent J. Edgar Hoover, the director, wanted to represent the Bureau. Rico was assigned to the FBI's Boston office and quickly distinguished himself as an intelligent, thorough investigator. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the FBI escalated its war against the mafia, Rico became one of the key agents targeting New England's Italian mafia, particularly the Patriarca crime family that controlled organized crime throughout the region. The FBI's strategy against the mob relied heavily on developing informants within criminal organizations, people who would provide inside information in exchange for protection from prosecution. Rico understood that the best informants weren't low-level criminals, but high-ranking gangsters who had access to sensitive information. And he was willing to pay almost any price to reach such sources. In the early 1960s, Rico recruited 2 men who would become his most valuable and most dangerous informants: Vincent "Jimmy the Bear" Flemmi and Joseph "the Animal" Barboza. Both were stone-cold killers with extensive criminal records. Jimmy Flemmi was a hitman and enforcer who'd committed numerous murders. Barboza was even worse. a brutal enforcer who enjoyed violence and had killed at least 26 people. Just like Connolly, Rico's relationship with these informants went far beyond handler and informant. He socialized with them, protected them from the law, and allowed them to continue committing crimes while serving as FBI sources. When other law enforcement agencies tried to investigate his informants, Rico would then argue that prosecuting them would compromise major investigations into the Italian mafia. Rico convinced himself, and his FBI superiors, that this arrangement served the greater good. His informants provided intelligence about mafia operations, testified in cases against Italian mobsters, and helped the FBI secure convictions. The fact that these informants were themselves murderers didn't seem to trouble Rico. He stayed firm with his belief. Protecting a few violent criminals was acceptable if it helped destroy organized crime. But Rico took his protection of informants to another level. He didn't just allow them to commit crimes, he helped them frame innocent people for murders they didn't commit, then hid evidence that would have proven those people's innocence. The key relationship was with Joseph Barboza. By the mid-1960s, Barboza had fallen out with the Italian mob and feared for his life. He approached the FBI, offering to become a government witness against the mafia. Rico saw an opportunity and became Barboza's handler. The FBI placed Barboza in protective custody and prepared him to testify in multiple murder trials. Rico spent countless hours with Barboza, coaching him, protecting him, and making sure he'd be an effective witness. What Rico knew, or should have known, was that Barboza was a liar who would say anything to help himself and hurt his enemies. The corruption that would define H. Paul Rico's legacy began building in the early 1960s as Boston's underworld erupted into a gang war between Irish and Italian factions. Bodies were piling up across the city, and law enforcement pressure was intensifying. The FBI was determined to use this chaos to destroy the Italian mafia, and Rico saw the gang war as an opportunity. On March 12, 1965, a small-time criminal named Edward Teddy Deegan was lured to an alley in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and murdered. Deegan had been marked for death because he was suspected of being involved in crimes that had angered organized crime figures. He was shot and stabbed multiple times, and his body was left in an alley in a message to others who might cross the mob. Rico knew within days, possibly within hours, who had actually killed Teddy Deegan. His informants, including Jimmy Flemmi and Joseph Barboza, had told him the truth. The murder had been committed by Barboza, Jimmy Flemmi, and several other criminals working for the mob. Rico documented this information in FBI reports that were filed and classified. But publicly, Rico did nothing to solve the murder. The case remained open, with local police and state investigators working to identify the killers. But then something happened. Joseph Barboza, one of the actual murderers, offered to testify that completely different people had committed the crime. By 1967, Barboza had become a government witness, and he was willing to testify in the Deegan murder case. But instead of telling the truth about who killed Deegan, Barboza lied. He claimed that 4 men, Louis Greco, Henry Tamelio, Peter Limone, and Joseph Salvati, had been involved in the murder. This was completely false. These men had nothing to do with Deegan's death. If you're asking why Barboza would lie, it's because the 4 men he falsely accused were connected to the Italian mob, and framing them served multiple purposes. It removed mob figures from the streets. It made Barboza look like a valuable witness willing to testify against powerful criminals, and it protected the actual killers, including Barboza himself and Rico's informant, Jimmy Flemmi. Rico knew Barboza was lying. The FBI's own files documented who had really killed Deegan, and those files made clear that Greco, Tamelio, Limone, and Salvati weren't involved. But Rico not only allowed Barboza to testify falsely, he also supported the wrongful prosecution of these innocent men. Rico prepared Barboza for trial, coaching him on his testimony and helping him refine his story. When defense attorneys questioned inconsistencies in Barboza's account, Rico vouched for his credibility as a witness, When questions arose about whether the FBI had evidence contradicting Barbosa's testimony, Rico hid the FBI's files that documented the truth. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1960s, Rico's informants committed numerous crimes: murders, assaults, extortions, while under FBI protection. Rico would learn about these crimes from his sources, document them in confidential reports, and then do nothing to stop them or bring the suspects to justice. When other law enforcement agencies investigated crimes committed by his informants, Rico would step in and protect them. Rico's corruption was enabled by the FBI's institutional culture at the time. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was obsessed with destroying the Italian mafia and producing high-profile arrests. Agents who developed productive informants and secured big cases were rewarded with promotions and commendations. Questions about methods or ethics were discouraged. The FBI operated with minimal oversight, and agents like Rico had control over how they handled informants. By the late 1960s, Rico had become one of the FBI's most successful agents in the war against organized crime. He'd helped secure convictions in multiple major cases. His informants had provided intelligence that led to dozens of prosecutions. He was respected, promoted, and held up as an example of effective law enforcement. But this success was built on a foundation of lies, hidden evidence, and the destruction of innocent lives. The full scope of Paul Rico's crimes were discovered across multiple decades and destroyed numerous lives. But the Deegan murder case stands as the most infamous one. The Deegan murder frame-up began in 1967 when Joseph Barbosa testified before a grand jury and in open court that Louis Greco, Henry Tamelio, Peter Limone, and Joseph Salvati had participated in Edward Deegan's murder. Barbosa's testimony was detailed and convincing. He described planning meetings, described who did what, and presented a narrative that seemed trustworthy to prosecutors and jurors who didn't know he was lying. Rico sat in the courtroom during Barbosa's testimony, watching as innocent men were convicted based on false evidence. He knew the truth. His own FBI reports documented that Jimmy Flemmi and Barbosa himself had killed Deegan, and that the four defendants hadn't been involved. But Rico said nothing. When defense attorneys tried to access FBI files that might have contained exculpatory evidence, the FBI refused, citing national security and the need to protect confidential sources. The jury believed Barbosa. In July 1968, all four defendants were convicted. Greco, Tamelio, and Limone were sentenced to death. Salvati received a life sentence. The death sentences were later reduced to life imprisonment when Massachusetts ended the death penalty. But the result was the same. 4 innocent men would spend the rest of their lives in prison for a murder they didn't commit. Rico knew exactly what he'd done. FBI documents that wouldn't surface until decades later showed that the Bureau had information before the trial, proving these men were innocent. An FBI memo from 1965, 3 years before the trial, stated that Barbosa and Jimmy Flemmi had killed Deegan. Another memo documented that the FBI knew Barbosa planned to testify falsely. Rico had read these memos. He'd authored some of them, and he'd decided that protecting his informants was more important than preventing wrongful convictions. The pattern of informant protection extended far beyond the Deegan case. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Rico's informants committed crime after crime while under FBI protection. Vincent Flemmi, Rico's key informant, was involved in at least 10 murders during the period he was providing information to the FBI. Rico knew about many of these killings, but took no action to prevent them or to arrest Flemmi afterward. The post-FBI criminal enterprise represented another dimension of Rico's corruption. When Rico retired from the FBI in 1975, he went to work as head of security for World High Lie, a company that operated gambling fronts in Connecticut and Florida. World High Lie was owned by Roger Wheeler, a businessman from Oklahoma, but was heavily influenced by organized crime figures who took money from the operations. Rico's FBI background made him useful to criminals. He understood how investigations worked, knew how to avoid law enforcement investigations, and had connections throughout the law enforcement community. He essentially became a fixer for organized crime, using his expertise to help criminals avoid detection. In the early 1980s, Roger Wheeler discovered that his company was being robbed by its own employees working with organized crime. Wheeler threatened to expose the scheme and go to law enforcement. This created a problem for the criminals stealing from him, including John Callahan, a corrupt executive at World Highlight, and James Whitey Bulger's Winter Hill Gang, which was receiving stolen money from the operation. On May 27, 1981, Roger Wheeler was shot in the head while sitting in his car outside a country club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was murdered on the orders of the Winter Hill Gang to prevent him from exposing the criminal enterprise. The killer was John Martirano, a professional hitman working for the gang. Evidence that emerged decades later suggested that H. Paul Rico had prior knowledge of the murder plot and had participated in planning it. Rico had connections to the key players. He'd worked with Whitey Bulger's FBI handler, John Connolly, during his years in Boston, and he maintained relationships with organized crime figures through his work at World Highlight. Phone records and testimony from cooperating witnesses placed Rico in contact with the conspirators before and after the murder. The Callahan murder followed in 1982. John Callahan, the World Highlight executive who'd helped arrange Wheeler's murder, became a liability. He knew too much and was drinking heavily, raising concerns that he might talk to law enforcement. Whitey Bulger and his associates decided Callahan needed to be killed. On August 2, 1982, Callahan was lured to Miami and shot to death. His body was found in the trunk of a Cadillac at Miami International Airport. Once again, evidence suggested Rico had knowledge of the murder plot and had participated in it. Later on, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the four men convicted in the Deegan murder, Greco, Tamelio, Limon, and Salvati, maintained their innocence and filed appeal after appeal. Their attorneys argued that the prosecution had relied on false testimony from Joseph Barboza, that the FBI had concealed evidence, and that the convictions were unfair. Every appeal was denied. Courts consistently ruled that Barboza's testimony had been true and that the convictions were sound. Louis Greco died in prison in 1995, having spent 28 years incarcerated for a murder he didn't commit. Henry Tamelio died in prison in 1985 after 17 years behind bars. They would never see justice. The breakthrough came in the late 1990s, when defense attorneys working on behalf of the remaining imprisoned men, Peter Limon and Joseph Salvati, discovered something extraordinary. The FBI had conducted an internal investigation in the 1970s, examining its use of informants in Boston. That investigation had uncovered evidence that Barboza had lied in the Deegan trial, and that FBI agents, including H. Paul Rico, had known about it. But instead of releasing this information or notifying the courts, the FBI had classified the documents and kept them secret. For more than 20 years, the FBI had possessed evidence that could have helped the innocent men and had done nothing. In 2000, U.S. District Judge Mark Wolf ordered the FBI to release its files related to the use of informants in Boston. What emerged was shocking. FBI memos from 1965, 3 years before the trial, showed that the Bureau knew Vincent Flemmi and Joseph Barboza had killed Edward Deegan. Another memo documented that the FBI knew Barboza planned to give false testimony. Reports showed that H. Paul Rico and his partner Dennis Condon had been aware that 4 innocent men were being prosecuted. The documents made clear that Rico hadn't made a mistake or been deceived. He'd allowed innocent men to be convicted on purpose to protect his informants and secure convictions against Italian mobsters. The revelations sparked outrage and led to congressional hearings examining FBI corruption in Boston. The House Government Reform Committee conducted an extensive investigation into how the FBI had used informants and whether the Bureau had knowingly allowed innocent people to be convicted. In 2002, H. Paul Rico was called to testify before Congress. Now 76 years old and long retired, Rico appeared as a witness and was questioned about his role in the Deegan case. His testimony was chilling. When asked whether he'd felt any remorse about innocent men spending decades in prison, Rico coldly replied, "What do you want, tears?" When pressed about whether protecting informants justified the imprisonment of innocent people, Rico stated, "That's the way the game is played." His lack of remorse shocked even hardened congressional investigators. Representative Dan Burton, who chaired the committee, told Rico, "I think the actions of the FBI in this case were criminal." The congressional investigation revealed that Rico's corruption was part of a pattern of misconduct in the FBI's Boston office that had lasted decades. In 2003, more than 20 years after Wheeler's murder, Oklahoma authorities secured cooperation from several criminals connected to the case. John Martirano, the hitman who'd actually shot Wheeler, pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. Stephen Flemmi and other associates provided information about the conspiracy. Their testimony implicated H. Paul Rico as having participated in planning Wheeler's murder. On January 20th, 2004, Oklahoma prosecutors charged Rico with first-degree murder in Wheeler's death. Allegedly, Rico had conspired with members of Whitey Bulger's Winter Hill gang to murder Wheeler and had participated in planning the killing. Rico was 78 years old, living in Florida, and had assumed he'd never face consequences for his crimes. Rico was arrested and handed over to Oklahoma to face trial. He maintained his innocence, claiming he'd had nothing to do with Wheeler's murder, and that cooperating criminals were lying to reduce their own sentences. The case presented challenges for both sides. For the prosecution, relying on testimony from murderers and gangsters was always problematic. For the defense, Rico's documented history of corruption made it possible that he'd participated in a murder conspiracy after leaving the FBI. But the trial would never reach a conclusion. On January 16, 2004, just days before jury selection was scheduled to begin, H. Paul Rico died in custody. He was 78 years old and had been suffering from various health problems. His death occurred at the Tulsa County Jail, where he was being held awaiting trial. The official cause of death was listed as congestive heart failure. Some family members and supporters claimed the stress of prosecution had killed him, while critics argued he'd simply died before facing justice for his crimes. With Rico's death, the criminal case was dismissed. He would never be convicted of Wheeler's murder, never serve time for his role in the conspiracy, and never face full accountability for decades of corruption. However, civil proceedings continued. The wrongfully convicted men, Limon, Salvati, and the estates of Greco and Tamelio, filed a massive civil lawsuit against the federal government, seeking damages for their wrongful imprisonment. In 2007, a federal judge awarded $101.7 million to the accused, one of the largest settlements ever paid in a wrongful conviction case. The government initially appealed, but eventually agreed to pay. While no amount of money could restore the decades stolen from these men, the settlement represented an acknowledgement of the government's responsibility. Because H. Paul Rico died before his trial concluded, he never faced formal sentencing for his crimes. However, the impact of his corruption on his victims was documented extensively through the wrongful conviction civil case and congressional testimony. Peter Limon, who'd spent 33 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, testified about the psychological torture of wrongful imprisonment. He described missing his children's entire childhoods, watching his parents die while he was behind bars, and enduring decades of being labeled a murderer. He spoke about other inmates asking what he'd done and the embarrassment of being convicted of a crime he had no connection to. Limon maintained his sanity only through his family's unwavering support and his faith that truth would eventually prevail. Joseph Salvati described what he felt in a similar way. He'd been 24 years old when convicted, a young father with his whole life ahead of him. He spent 30 years in prison, missing his children growing up, missing anniversaries and birthdays and ordinary moments that define a family. His wife, Marie, campaigned for his release for 3 decades, writing letters, meeting with politicians, and never giving up hope. When Salvati was finally released, he and Marie had been separated for 30 years, but their marriage had survived. The families of Louis Greco and Henry Tamaleo testified about men who died in prison, never vindicated, never hearing their names cleared. Greco's family described visiting him in prison for 28 years, watching him deteriorate physically and emotionally, knowing he was innocent but unable to prove it. Tamaleo's family spoke about the added cruelty of his death sentence, spending years on death row for a crime he didn't commit before the sentence was commuted. Roger Wheeler's family testified about their loss and the added pain of knowing that law enforcement corruption had enabled his murder. They described how Wheeler had been a legitimate businessman trying to expose criminal activity, only to be killed with the knowledge or participation of a former FBI agent. The civil case proceedings allowed these victims and their families to finally have their suffering acknowledged officially. Judge Wolf, in his ruling awarding damages, stated that FBI agents, including Rico, had engaged in outrageous conduct that violated the rights of innocent men. Peter Limon and Joseph Salvati lived as free men after their 2001 release. Limon became an advocate for criminal justice reform and works to help other wrongfully convicted individuals. He died in 2017 at age 83, having spent his final years with his family and restored reputation. Salvati also lived quietly with his family until his death in 2022 at age 88. Having finally experienced freedom after 3 decades of wrongful imprisonment. The $101.7 million settlement was distributed among Limon, Salvati, and the estates of Greco and Tamaleo. While no amount of money could restore what was stolen, it represented the largest wrongful conviction settlement in U.S. history and an acknowledgement of the government's profound failures. The Rico case, combined with the John Connolly prosecution and other revelations about FBI corruption in Boston, forced the Bureau to reform and completely change how it manages confidential informants. New guidelines require agents to document informant crimes, prohibit hiding evidence that could help defendants, and establish more effective oversight. Congressional investigations led by the House Government Reform Committee exposed the full scope of FBI corruption in Boston and resulted in policy changes throughout the Bureau. The reforms came too late for Rico's victims, but aimed to prevent similar abuses in the future. Rico's story stands as perhaps the darkest chapter in FBI history. A story about what happens when law enforcement becomes so obsessed with prosecuting criminals that it destroys innocent lives in the process. If you enjoyed this deep dive into every detective who went from trusted officer to mob informant, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.